Code 3. A live podcast sponsored by the Marin Fire History Group. All about the history of the fire service in Marin County, California. And now your host, retired Fire Chief Bill Lellis.
Good day, and once again, welcome to the Marin County Fire Chief's historical website. At the time of this recording, it is Fire Prevention Week, and we will be addressing fire prevention with our guest, Deputy Fire Chief Keith Schoenthal of the San Rafael Fire Department. We'll be talking to him live from his home in Cotati. And what I thought we'd do before we introduce the chief is kind of a quick history of fire prevention. Since I entered the fire service in 1958, I thought I'd go back there and bring us up to pretty much where we are now. In 1958, there was no fire code as we have now come to understand it. We used bulletins that came out of the National Board of Fire Underwriters in downtown New York. It was a little green book. A lot of us couldn't understand what it was saying. Then down the road, the Western fire chiefs got together and their fire marshals wrote what would become the California Fire Code now. So the first fire code probably had 100 pages in it, but it was a fire code and it's something an inspector could fall back on and look. And today's 2019 edition of the California Fire Code now has probably over 600 pages. So it keeps growing. The concerns are each year another edition, another chapter is added or chapters are expanded. So fire prevention has come a long, long way. And when we get in talking with Keith Schoenthal, when he was the fire marshal in San Rafael, he developed an inspection program that really proved the fact that fire prevention does pay. And it was always a question, did fire prevention really work, or was it worth having fire inspectors and so forth? But we're going to talk about a survey we did in San Rafael. Chief Bob Marcucci placed in with Keith. So with that, I would like to introduce you to Deputy Fire Chief Keith Schoenthal of the San Rafael Fire Department. Good evening, Chief, and welcome aboard.
Good evening, Bill. Nice to be here.
Yeah, good. So we'll talk a little bit about your history first, and it's my understanding that you started out as a Boy Scout, and where did that take place, and how did you kind of get into the fire service in Southern California? So I'll give it to you. Go for it.
All right. Well, I actually started as an Explorer Scout in what was then the Twin Hills Fire Explorer Post, just outside of the town of Sebastopol. That fire department is now Gold Ridge Fire Department, but the Explorer Post is still ongoing. Last summer, they had the 50th anniversary reunion of that Fire Explorer Post. A lot of career firefighters came out of that post, including people that are like Los Angeles County Battalion Chiefs, LA County Fire Battalion Chiefs. After that, I worked as a sleeper in Santa Rosa, and then moved to Southern California to get an education, and I worked for the City of Corona Fire Department for 3 years, about half that time on the line as a firefighter and half that time in the Fire Prevention Bureau, because the fire chief down there was very progressive. Jim Johnson was his name, and he came out of Cal Fire, and he wanted a fire protection engineer on staff. And he had read that at the beginning of my junior college career, I had taken some engineering type classes, physics and chemistry and whatnot. And he came out to the fire station and told the captain that he wanted to see me. And that was like an oh my gosh moment to a firefighter who had only been on the job for 18 months to have the fire chief come out and want to talk to you in the captain's office. And basically what Chief Johnson said is that we see that we know you have a degree from Cal State LA. We see that you have some engineering courses in your background. We want a fire protection engineer on our staff in the Fire Prevention Bureau. We will pay you to go to school and get your engineering degree. So that's how progressive Jim was. And from there, I got my second degree. My first one was fire administration, also from Cal State LA. And then I transferred to the Ontario Fire Department, also in Southern California. And so I spent 3 years at each of those agencies.
Okay. My apology, Keith. I wanted to apologize that Keith is a third-generation firefighter. His grandfather and his father were volunteer firemen up at Guerneville, correct, Keith? Is it Guerneville? Okay, that's good. So now you're in Southern California. You have all these degrees, which was absolutely incredible. You're right. That chief really was ahead of his time as far as fire prevention education, to have an engineer on staff. So now you're in Southern California, and when we first met, you were the fire marshal in San Rafael. And how did that come about?
Well, earlier in the year in 1983, Ken Mazza, who was San Rafael's fire marshal, I believe unexpectedly passed away. I don't know all the circumstances about that, but I know that San Rafael had an open recruitment for fire marshal, and I went through the process and was selected and told by the fire chief at the time, Bob Marcucci, that he really wanted me to be his fire marshal, but that the city didn't have any money. That was in the spring of 1983. He said he expected when the budget was passed at the end of June of that year that he would be able to fill the position, but he was being required to keep the position unfilled. Shortly after the turn of the budget year in July, I got a phone call back from Chief Marcucci saying that the fire marshal's position had been funded and we completed the process, and I started working for Bob and the San Rafael Fire Department in August of 1983.
Okay. And where was your office? Yeah, I know.
This is the old fire station in San Rafael, which is now being torn down and being rebuilt as a public safety building. When I first started in San Rafael, there were two bays that went out, two fire apparatus bays that went out onto C Street, and two that went out onto Fifth Avenue. One of them was an angled bay that they used for the mechanics bay, and the other one just had, like, it was storage that had a reserve utility vehicle in it. But we had to kind of skinny by the battalion chief's office and that vehicle to get around the corner into our office that was for two people, but had a huge plan check table in the middle of it.
I recall that space because I would go up and talk with Ken Mazza on a number of days. He was the only fire marshal in the county at the time, and he was like the god of fire code. So on many occasion, I would go up into that squad space and say, "Wow, this is quite an office here." So I would never complain about my office back in Larkspur. So now you're off and running. I want to get into that. Let me explain to the viewers that I was hired by Chief Schoenthal to do a special project. That project lasted 11 years. But one of the things, I was a retired fire chief at the time when I went to work for Keith, but Keith had developed an inspection program for the engine companies that was, to this day, I'm still very impressed with it, as much as I was still working fire prevention every day. So I would like, Keith, if you would, could you kind of explain how you came about that 100-item list and by occupancy versus just a general form, and we'll talk a little bit about that 10-year study we did. So kind of tell us how you came about that inspection procedure.
Well, the first fire inspector that was working with me in San Rafael also passed away unexpectedly. His name was Sev Merrill. Mm-hmm. And when Sev passed away, we hired, as an extra hire, a firefighter from Ross Valley Fire Department by the name of Forrest Craig. When Sev's position came available, we tested for it, and Forrest was the person that we selected to be the new fire inspector for San Rafael. And Forrest and I really wanted to sit down and revamp our company inspection program. The company inspection program forms were, kind of outdated. They were look for extension cords and look for fire extinguishers, check the date on the fire extinguishers, and that was about it. And we knew that as a two-person fire prevention bureau, that we really needed a better set of eyes in the field to do inspections for us. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to create different forms based on the occupancy. So if it was, at that time we were in the Uniform Building Code rather than the International Building Code, so the B, general business occupancies, had one form. The public assembly occupancies had a different form. The hazardous occupancies had yet another form. And the educational occupancies, the schools and whatnot, and then the hospitals, the institution forms, the Bureau inspected, so we did not make a form for them. But what we did is we looked at what were the specific hazards in each of those kind of occupancies. So in a public assembly occupancy, we wanted to make sure that all of the exits were there. That if it was over 50 people, that they had 2 exits. If it was over 500, they had 3, and they had panic hardware, and the exit doors went the right direction and all that. But in a hazardous occupancy, say a woodworking shop, we wanted to make sure that the fire sprinklers that were required when that building was made a woodworking shop were in effect. And so we made up different forms for each of the type of occupancies, and then subjected, I'm going to use that word, our company personnel to training on the new forms, and there was a large manual that went with it that had it had the line from the form and then like a paragraph explanation of why that was important for them to look at.
Yeah. To this day, Keith, I'll tell you, I still think it's one of the best documents on fire prevention I've seen, especially for the engine company personnel to be able to look at a line, a small paragraph explaining what the number line that they're looking at to check off is all about. It was just a wonderful idea. Quickly, I just want to explain to the viewers that there's always that issue early in the game was fire prevention really paying for itself, and was it worth hiring inspectors and so forth? So under the direction of Chief Bob Marcucci, we decided to take your forms and do a 10-year study of all the engine company inspections using those 100 items as was any fire caused by one of those 100 items, which meant a captain or something may have been missed. And in our study, it was absolutely amazing that in 10 years, the city of San Rafael had not one fire that was caused by any one of those 100 items that the captains had to address. And to this day, I still say fire prevention pays for itself. It was a good piece of information that the chief could take to administration and go forward. Keith, what I'd like to talk about now is we got the history. Let's talk a little bit about how you saw the future and where it came from and where it is now as it relates to fire prevention and what has been implemented to improve that to the communities. Okay, so I'll turn it back over to you, Keith.
Well, going back, I think you mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast the America Burning study. And basically, America Burning attributed fire loss data to preventable fires. And it came up with what they considered some solutions. And they were more looking at fire deaths rather than property loss. And they came up with some things that should happen, like smoke detectors in the home. And I can remember at the beginning of my career, when smoke detectors were not what they are now. I mean, we've gone, since I started, there's been like 4 generations of smoke detectors. The ones we have now with the 10-year battery that are disposable, and before that it was, 9-volt batteries that we always preached at Fire Prevention Week to change your clock, change your batteries, and we're still doing that. And before that, the smoke detectors that were out there were proprietary. It was a smoke detector, and it had like a 12.2 volt battery that only the company that made the smoke detector could replace, and they were very expensive. and I can remember early on the battles with the home builders associations,
Yes.
not homeowners groups, home builders associations, that, oh my gosh, adding these new things to a house was going to drive up the cost of housing and make it impossible for people to get into starter homes. And you know, it was, they were trying to make their point, but they did a lousy job of it. Fortunately, the National Fire Administration was created, and they pushed smoke detectors. The National Fire Protection Association pushed smoke detectors, and now, you know, nobody thinks twice about smoke detectors. I mean, now we have one. You know, we have one in the hallway and one in each bedroom, and if you've got a multiple level house, you've got to have one on every level, and they've got to be interconnected when you're building a house. And even now, I was able to find, when I was back in Pennsylvania visiting my daughter, I was able to find at Home Depot battery operated smoke detectors that have little switches in them that you can switch so they're all in the same code. So if one goes off, they all go off, just like the wired interconnected ones, but they're battery operated. That's just wonderful.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear you say you had that fight with the. I thought I was the only one in the county in Larkspur that had a fight. I mean, the Builders Exchange really came on heavy. They actually said it would cost to put a smoke. Now, the first smoke detectors at the time, I think they costed like a $95, and they were just, you know, an ugly thing compared to today's appliances. But the fight was terrible. I mean, and so when we started, we're going to talk about sprinkler systems in a minute, but when we in Larkspur decided to pass a sprinkler ordinance, we passed it through the building fire code, which didn't have to go to the Builders Exchange for review. All building code changes at that time went to the Builders Exchange for their comment. So that's how we kind of got around Larkspur's sprinkler ordinance. But let's talk about sprinklers, Keith. The importance they played. Governor passed a law that all the new homes have to be sprinkled now. And what do you think about that?
I think it's a great law, and I think it also shows the maturity of the line fire department. You know, when we started in San Rafael, when we started our fire sprinkler ordinance, there was not opposition by our line firefighters to it, but there was certainly grumbling in the fire stations about how we were taking their jobs away from them. Because if we put sprinklers in houses, it was going to put fires out, and they weren't going to have to go put fires out anymore, and, you know, save babies and all that stuff. But now, there was just an article that came out. It was on a Facebook article that in Virginia, the state of Virginia is going retroactive. They are going against requiring residential fire sprinkler systems. And the line firefighters are part of the ones leading the charge, saying that's a terrible idea. We need to put sprinklers in houses.
Wow. So Arnold Schwarzenegger, to his credit, we have to give him the credit. When he was governor of California, he's the one that passed, I think we were the first state in the union to pass an ordinance that required all new single-family homes, R3s, to be fully sprinkled. And what I do every day, I'm the fire marshal currently at the Rodeo Hercules Fire Department, and I'm telling you, it's working. It's paying off. The next generation of firefighters will see the benefit of what Governor Schwarzenegger did for the fire service. And it's just a matter now, probably the next step is maybe apartment houses down the road. So what are your thoughts about where the future is in fire prevention? What do you think is going to be happening? Take a wild guess.
I'm sorry, repeat the question, Bill?
What do you think the future lies for fire prevention? So take a wild three-dimension guess out there. Where do you think we're going?
Well, you're probably asking the wrong guy, Bill. I haven't been retired as long as you have. I've only been retired 10 years.
Okay.
But it was great to have you come back and work for us after you retired from Larkspur. But, you know, when I retired from the fire service, I had been in a different role. I hadn't been in fire prevention for 3 years. And that was at the same time that they were transitioning from the Uniform Building Code, Uniform Fire Code, to the International Building and Fire Codes. So by the time I retired, they change codes, and that new code had gone through one complete code cycle. And I was just not in any desirous mood to go out and study the new code to become a consultant. I've got a lot of friends that were fire marshals and fire inspectors that still make a good living doing consulting work in the fire prevention business. And I probably could have done that, doing building plan checks for architects and stuff, but it just was not something that was keen to me. So I can't tell you where fire prevention is going. I do know that in San Rafael, the reason that I was in the position I was in for the last 3 years was because there was a, shall we say, a disagreement about the code enforcement aspects of the building code as adopted by the state fire marshal's office. I had taught a class for the state fire marshal's office for 15 years at their state fire academy in the upper division on how to do construction plan reviews of new buildings based on the California building code, because the state fire marshal has authority over building construction in public assembly occupancies, schools, hospitals, and residential occupancies 3 stories or more in height. And anything that is the state code. It's not the city's adoption of the at that time the uniform building code. It was the state fire marshal's adoption through the Building Standards Commission of the state building code. So if anybody wanted to appeal, they had to appeal to the State Building Standards Commission. Well, our mayor at the time wanted to have an appeal come before him because he wanted to, I think, approve the appeal. And when he found out that that wasn't how it could be, I think he wanted to move fire prevention where he could have a little bit more control over it.
Okay. All right. You know, I know what you're saying, though. We did in California. We hung on to that old uniform fire code for. It was very difficult for me also making that transition to the new code and having to learn all the chapters and so forth. But in life, it worked out. Hey, Chief, I want to thank you so much for participating in this Fire Prevention Week special edition of the website video. And I know you're very busy with Boy Scouts, and thank you for the help you gave my daughter and my son, who went down to someplace in New Mexico to hike. So it worked out real well. He's got 1,000 photos he wants to show us. So, but again, I just want to thank you, and I again thank you for what you're doing for the Boy Scouts of America. And I know you're heavily involved in it since you retired. And I thank you, and Dan, Baldwin, producer here, also thanks us. So Keith, I want to say thank you. It was a pleasure working for you those 11 years. I will say one thing, Keith, and I told Dan that today. Anytime I had a question, whatever you were doing, you stopped and you took the time to explain it to me. And I always appreciated that, because none of us know everything. But it's to be able to do that and have that talent is nice. So again, once again, Chief, thanks so much for participating. Wish you well. Say hi to the family, and take care of yourself and be safe.
All right, Bill. Thank you.
You bet. The article, send it in to us. We're constantly looking for new stuff. And again, so that's what's going on this Fire Prevention Week. And we wish you well, and as we always say, be safe and keep them small.